In part 1 of this trilogy, I discussed how capitalists exploited social and cultural anxieties to fuse economic and social conservatism in order to attack New Deal policy. In this video, I will focus specifically on how capitalists began forging political coalitions that could counter the dominance of the Democratic Party. Most of you have probably heard at one point or another about the Southern Strategy, which constituted Republican overtures to win over Southern Democrats.
Start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger, that hurts you, backfires, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites.
But it's important to understand that the Southern Strategy was actually part of a larger strategy to woo suburban voters, not just in the Sunbelt, but nationwide. If you find this video informative or entertaining, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. What sustained the New Deal was the Roosevelt Coalition, which enabled Democrats to control the Senate and the House of Representatives for the better part of 60 years. This coalition consisted of farm workers, laborers, Southern whites, and African Americans. Two of those constituencies, blacks and Southern whites, were incompatible. Black voters wanted greater economic, civil, and voting rights, while Southern whites wanted to deny them these things. This contradiction forced Democrats to increasingly have to choose between their Northern liberal wing and their Southern racist wing. Nothing guaranteed that blacks would continue to vote for Democrats as they had for Franklin Roosevelt. Before the 1930s, blacks reliably voted for the party of Lincoln. To keep the black vote, Harry Truman embraced civil rights. He issued an executive order ending segregation in the military, and he included in his 1948 re-election plank a resolution supporting civil rights. This infuriated Southern Democrats. Perhaps the most powerful Southern Democrat, South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond, left the Democratic Party and formed the States' Rights Party, which almost cost Truman the 1948 election. Truman still won, though, because of black support. But 1948 illustrated that Southern states were there for the taking. Conservatives saw potential in cultivating the Southern white vote. In an editorial for the leading conservative journal, the National Review, William Buckley wrote that the white community in the South is entitled to take such measures as are necessary to prevail, politically and culturally, in areas in which it does not predominate numerically, because, for the time being, it is the advanced race. Unlike conservative intellectuals, however, Republican politicians still wanted to win back the black vote. In 1960, the Republican candidate for president, Richard Nixon, openly declared support for a Civil Rights Act and for Brown v. Board of Education. Still, he narrowly lost to John Kennedy, largely because of the black vote. The first conservative politician who sees the opportunity in the South and embraces it was Barry Goldwater, a very influential and prominent Arizona retailer and political figure. Like many passionately conservative capitalists, Barry Goldwater inherited his business from his father. During the 1940s and 1950s, he had worked through the Phoenix Chamber of Commerce with other prominent Arizonan businessmen and capitalists to defeat the labor movement in Arizona. Before the 1930s, mining, ranching, and agricultural commodity production dominated the economies of the western states. But the New Deal invested tens of billions into the West and South. The WPA built 1,700 miles of road in Arizona, federal housing insurance stimulated a housing boom, and over $60 billion in defense contracts in the West helped industrial employment in Arizona jump 466% between 1939 and 1959. Capitalists like Barry Goldwater wanted to ensure that western states would continue to benefit from defense contracts and federal largesse, yet not succumb to New Deal regulations on business and worker power through unions. He achieved this in Arizona not by presenting himself as a conservative, but as a Jeffersonian Democrat who really cared about saving the little man from abusive government bureaucrats and labor bosses. He depicted unions as hierarchical organizations with bosses that dominated rank-and-file workers. Anti-unionism, in other words, was pro-democracy. In his 1952 Senate campaign, he contended that liberals had introduced P's and Q's in federal government. Big personal profit quietly and quickly. He promised Republicans would put an end to waste and using government as a personal possession for private looting. And he pushed Arizonans to stop big government because waste and wild experiments and giveaways in government creates deficits and deficits create inflation, and that in the end the ultimate consumer pays the ultimate price. These arguments appealed to the suburban middle class created by huge Cold War defense spending and by government programs which built national highways that connected Arizona, a mostly landlocked desert, to the rest of the country. By the 1960s, 80% of Arizona factories employed a mostly or exclusively white workforce. Thus, even though the white middle classes of the Sunbelt were created by the New Deal, they still liked calls for small government to prevent New Deal-style programs from benefiting poor blacks and Mexican Americans who were concentrated in the cities. Goldwater eventually brought his implicit racial and class politics to the national stage. In a private luncheon, he said that no matter what Republicans did, they would not win back black votes. So, we need to go hunting where the ducks are. And by that he meant Republicans needed to win the Southern white vote. In the early 1960s, Goldwater published a book called The Conscience of a Conservative, which connected the three strands of conservatism: economic conservatism, social conservatism, and neoconservatism. In this book he argued, or at least his ghostwriter argued on his behalf, that liberalism was only concerned with the material side of man, whereas conservatism was concerned with the whole person, with his moral and spiritual part. In trying to compel progress, that is to use government to eliminate poverty, insecurity, and inequality, liberals fought against nature. For the lessons of history was that man's most sacred possession was his individual soul. To treat a person as part of an undifferentiated mass was to consign him to slavery. History showed that freedom required order, but order itself threatened man's liberty. This was because throughout history, government proved to be the chief threat against liberty. The framers of the Constitution understood this, not because they were students of history, but because they were victims of it, that is, victims of British tyranny. So they created a system of government which limited the power of both the central government and of the masses. They knew that too much democracy threatened individual liberty, and that the best way to deal with any problem was locally, because who better understands the nature of a problem than those closest to it? Finally, he said the founders understood that property and freedom were inseparable. A man could not really be free if his property was treated as part of a common resource. Therefore, the system of government the founders created was based on the very nature of man, and deviations from this system fundamentally threatened liberty. So how does this relate to winning the South? Goldwater argued that Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruling ending segregation in education, was bad. Whatever one felt about Jim Crow, Southerners best understood how to deal with their own race issues. And even if they were wrong, federal government intervention violated the framers' fragile and necessary framework. So he says he's personally for civil rights, but doesn't think that the federal government has a right to enforce them. This is how he could oppose civil rights while also claiming to not be a racist. What about neoconservatism, the doctrine which says that the U.S. should actively and militarily promote its interests around the world? Well, Goldwater stated that it doesn't matter what kinds of social institutions you have if communists conquered the country. The foundations of freedom lay in a powerful and active military that would prevent the global spread of communism. So while supporting cutting social programs, he wanted to massively expand the military. Conscience of a Conservative resonated with a lot of Republicans, particularly with the suburbs, who embraced Goldwater's arguments about individualism, private property, and the spiritual and moral nature of man. Suburban housewives organized to support Goldwater, and a swelling of grassroots supports lifted him to the Republican nomination. At the Republican convention, Goldwater denounced big government and declared that
extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
He even stated he would be willing to use nuclear bombs to defeat the communists in Vietnam. So while liberals were coming to the position that politics was about ascertaining the best techniques to address large-scale problems, Goldwater was making politics into a crusade of good versus evil. Goldwater's belligerence ultimately hurt him.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Goldwater lost the 1964 election in a landslide, but he won several Deep South states. So the question now was, how do you win the South without losing everything else? 5 days after Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, a riot broke out in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Watts after police beat and killed a black man. 34 people died in that riot, and 1,000 buildings were damaged. Riots spread to more than 40 cities. After studying the riots, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorder concluded that our nation was moving towards two societies, one black and one white, separate and unequal. In 1966, Ronald Reagan won the governorship of California by telling a different story. Reagan had been a B-level actor in the 1940s.
Well, that goddamn thing locked again.
He He was a Democrat and president of the Screen Actors Guild. During the Depression, every single male member of his family at one point or another worked for a government agency. He claimed that he became a Republican because the Democratic Party had moved too far left. And as late as 1960, he had campaigned as a Nixon Democrat. The reasons for his conversion is dubious, as he worked in the 1940s to out communists from Hollywood during the Red Scare, and in the 1950s gave speeches for General Electric about the dangers of socialism. A more likely explanation is that Reagan was a Democrat because his family was Democratic. He comes to national prominence after giving a speech at the Republican National Convention.
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves. You and I are told increasingly we have to choose between a left or right. Well, I'd like to suggest there is no such thing as a left or right. There's only an up or down. Man's old age dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. And regardless of their sincerity, their humanitarian motives, those who would trade our freedom for security have embarked on this downward course.
California businessmen, particularly oilmen and car dealers, see somebody who they think can become a charismatic national politician. But like Barry Goldwater, Reagan could come off as extreme. So they hired a social science research firm, the Behavioral Sciences Corporation of Rosetta, or BASICO, to completely remake Reagan. They trained him to connect everything he said with a central theme, the creative society. Rather than using apocalyptic language like totalitarian ant heaps, Reagan would present himself as a sunny advocate for freedom from government taxation, waste, and regulation, which would unleash the full creative forces of society. Basico provided him 8 books of 5x8 flashcards that Reagan memorized, so they had a pre-rehearsed talking point for any type of question. In other words, being a conservative politician may have been the greatest role that Reagan played in his acting career.
There you go again.
While the National Advisory on Civil Disorders reported that the Watts riot resulted from poverty and inequality, Reagan said it resulted from government pandering to the lawless elements of society. He pointed not just to the Watts riots, but to the student anti-war protest movement, which grew particularly hot in Berkeley. He campaigned on repressing the student protests, which enabled him to defeat Pat Brown, who was a popular and successful governor that had built up California's system of highways, created its university system, and he began construction of the state water system. Even though Reagan campaigned on smaller government, he also campaigned on expanding government to establish law and order. And the importance of this strategy is that he could oppose programs aimed at addressing inequality and poverty by simply saying that what we really need is more law and order. After Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, Reagan opined that it was a great tragedy that began when we began compromising with law and order, and people started choosing which laws they'd break. In other words, civil disobedience was morally equivalent to murder and assassination, and in part responsible for those things. Californians, however, like the government programs created by Pat Brown. So how did Ronald Reagan win on a platform of reducing government? In a strategy that will become particularly effective in the 1970s, he won't say which programs he will cut. Because it's one thing to say that government is a big wasteful tyrant, but it turns out most government programs are things people want. And when you start pointing out specific programs to cut, suddenly people aren't so enthusiastic. So he just vaguely says that he will reduce government waste. It was ardent Alabama segregationist and governor George Wallace who translated these tactics to the national level. A lifelong Democrat, Wallace ran in 1968 as an independent. His candidacy revolved around the claim that the federal government was creating lawlessness by pandering to the Molotov cocktail set. A Molotov cocktail is a kind of bomb associated with radicals, but Wallace also associated with those he claimed encouraged radicals, namely the cocktail-drinking elites, the pointed-headed intellectuals from the universities and from Washington, D.C., who tried to tell you how to live your life. The elite may say that it's poverty and inequality that leads to social disorder, but what do the elite know? They sit in their ivory towers insulated from the chaos of their policies.
America, take a good look. This was done by anarchists, revolutionaries, the Molotov cocktail set. Ask yourself, why are the anti-American, anti-God anarchists also violently anti-Wallace? Want to get rid of them? Then don't waste your vote on those who encourage the sit-ins and illegal marches. Vote for a law-abiding, God-fearing America.
This kind of argument appeals to the grievances of Southern whites and suburbanites. Southerners say that Northern intellectuals and elitists don't understand Southern culture, and the federal government imposing civil rights was causing disorder. The suburbanites said the federal government didn't understand poverty and crime. But we, the suburbanites, are not well off because of privileges or government programs, but because we are good, hardworking, law-abiding citizens. So rather than anti-poverty programs, the government needed to get tough on crime. After losing the California gubernatorial election of 1962, Nixon's career appeared over.
But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
He remade himself into a Wallace-light law and order Republican and runs for president in 1968. His campaign argued that the country needed not more poverty programs or civil rights programs, but more cops on the streets and more people in jail. He released a plan called Freedom from Fear, which claimed that doubling the conviction rate would do more to eliminate crime than quadrupling anti-poverty programs. Nixon wins, but only by 1%, so he needed a strategy for re-election. In 1969, an advisor to his campaign, Kevin Phillips, published a book called The Emerging Republican Majority, which argued that as Democrats became the party of civil rights and of African Americans, the suburbs in the South would go over to Republicans. Nixon had already been reaching out to the South. During his 1968 campaign, he obtained the endorsement of Strom Thurmond, and throughout his first term, he appointed conservative judges to the courts. To appeal to the suburbs, Nixon used the term the silent majority, which he first used in a 1969 speech. He asserted that the majority of Americans were God-fearing, hard-working, law-abiding, family people who just wanted to go about their lives in peace, but their voices were being drowned out by a militant, strident, entitled minority. In other words, the most privileged people in America, suburbanites, were actually the real victims.
Do you think a Negro family moving here will affect the community as a whole?
Definitely.
In what way?
I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they are allowed to move in. We will end up with mixing socially. And you will have, well, I think their aim is mixed marriages and becoming equal with the whites.
In 1972, Nixon won even bigger than Lyndon Johnson did in 1964. So is this where we can locate the triumph of conservatism and the defeat of the New Deal? Well, no. Despite his appeals to Southern Democrats, Nixon ran as a moderate. He could point to the fact that his administration created the Environmental Protection Agency. He refused to put an anti-labor plank in his platform. He opened up relations with China and negotiated an arms reduction agreement with the Soviet Union. For conservatism to ultimately triumph, the whole economic theory behind liberalism would have to be discredited, which would happen in the 1970s through stagflation. And I will cover that in part 3 of this trilogy. Thank you for watching this video. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe.